And our last speaker on the panel, and pretty sure most of you know this guy by now already, hopefully. Our next panelist, our last panelist, is Mr. Alex Epstein. And Alex Epstein is a philosopher and energy expert and the founder of the Center for Industrial Progress, which offers a positive, pro-human alternative to the green movement. He is the author of the new book, Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less, as well as the New York Times best-selling The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He's also the creator of EnergyTalkingPoints.com, a source of powerful, well-referenced talking points on energy, environmental, and climate issues. So everybody, a round of applause for Mr. Alex Epstein.
On a scale of -5 to 5, how good is the fossil fuel industry at promoting fossil fuels? Okay, we got a lot of hasty answers. First, we should ask, why is that the question? Why am I ranking it -5 to 5? Whenever I think of persuasion, most people use 1 to 10 to rank things. I always use -5 to 5. Anyone have an idea why? What's that? What do you mean there's no upside? Oh, I see. Well, it's actually the opposite. So the thing, I mean, you might be trying to capture it. So the reason I do it is because if you go 1 to 10, it kind of implies everything is positive, right? Even if you're a 3, okay, well, 3 is something. But this is not the way persuasion works. Anyone who's ever been in a relationship knows that sometimes when you open your mouth, it actually makes things worse. And this is very easy to do with any controversial issue, including energy. So I'm just curious what this room says. I'm going to count down from 5. So 5 is going to be whenever whenever the industry opened its mouth, scores of people or millions of people were persuaded. It would be amazing. 0 means nothing, like all the talk has amounted to nothing. And the -5 means it makes it much, much worse, and it would be better if they had never spoken at all. Okay, so just raise your hand when I get to the number. 5, 4. Nobody's ever given a 5 or a 4, by the way, no matter what. 3. All right, we got some here. 2, 1. All right, and I think we have 6 so far. 0. So, okay, this means everything has amounted to nothing. Now we're worse than that. -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. Okay, so I think we mostly agree there's room for improvement. That's a fair statement. So this is actually good news. It's very good news because and I think what the fossil fuel industry has done, I think in some ways they're worse than the average fossil fuel supporter, but in general, I'd say those of us who would consider ourselves fossil fuel supporters, there's a lot of room for improvement there. I think it's good news because given the hostility toward fossil fuels today and its consequences already, even though the net zero movement has had very little success in reducing fossil fuel use, they haven't reduced it, they've slowed its growth, but even that has caused a global energy crisis. It's like, if this were the best that could be done, that would be really bad, right? So it's always good if it's not going well, that there's a lot of room for improvement. So what I want to talk about today is, with respect to today's topic, is making a proactive, inspiring argument for fossil fuels versus a reactive, uninspiring argument for not rapidly reducing fossil fuels. So there's a big difference. So a proactive, inspiring argument for fossil fuels versus a reactive, uninspiring argument for not rapidly reducing fossil fuels. And I think that's historically and often today, although it is improving, there's often this reactive, uninspiring case, and it's about not reducing fossil fuels. I think the reason for this, so my background is philosophy, so I always think of things in terms of philosophy and how people's thinking is framed. I think the key reason for this is that the anti-fossil fuel movement has framed the conversation proactively, and then supporters of fossil fuels, including opponents of climate catastrophism, have just reacted. So, and I think this is a very significant idea. And in my book, Fossil Future, I talk about this concept of arguing to 100. So let me introduce this by asking, or let me introduce arguing to 100, and then I'll ask a question. So the idea of arguing to 100, and it's contrasted to arguing to 0, is that you argue for a policy by arguing that it achieves a moral goal. So you set the moral goal, and then you say, hey, this policy will achieve it. So historically, a great example I use in Fossil Future is Martin Luther King, he framed the issue in terms of skin color as not being judged by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. And that served as a goal that I think many, many people found inspiring in terms of skin color, and that, that's not really a relevant thing. It should be about the content of your character. And then he argued that this policy and this policy and this policy moved us toward that goal. Now, one thing you can do when an argument is framed and you disagree with it, almost always you want to question and reframe the goal. So an example of this, and I'm not endorsing it or condemning it, I'm just saying this is a good example and practice of it, is what happened in the 2016 election with Donald Trump. If you look at the way the conversation about American politics was going before Trump, I think it was primarily framed by Democrats, and it was primarily framed in terms of the goal, the 100 is a more equal society. And then when you have a 100, you always have a negative 100, which is the bad thing. And that was like a more unequal society. This is all about this issue of equality, and the goal is to become more equal. And what often people didn't really challenge that. They might challenge some of the specific details of policies, but what Trump did is he really totally changed the goal. So instead of arguing on this framing of equality, what was Trump's famous expression on his hat? So you all remember, right? Make America great again. I remember when I saw that, I thought this guy really knows what he's doing, because he has a 100. So his 100 was American greatness, and the negative 100 was American decline. And so he was able to frame it, and he argued for all of his policies in terms of this is going to advance American greatness. Like he had arguments for, his particular, and again, I'm not endorsing any of these policies, like his particular immigration policy, he really made that an issue in part by framing it in terms of American greatness. Even he was able to confidently argue for the coal industry, which almost nobody had been able to do, by making it part of American greatness. So, foreign policy, healthcare, all of these were arguments to 100. So let's ask, in the realm of energy and environmental issues, including climate issues, what is the framing? And I'll put it this way, what is the 100 today? I think the way to get at this is to ask, what is the number one moral goal in the world today in any field? So what is the number one moral goal in the world today in any field? And I would judge this by what is the goal that is shared most in common publicly by governments, corporations, and financial institutions. Okay, someone raised their hand. I just heard some abundance. I wish. Do no harm. I even wish that. Yes. Oh man, I don't know what world you guys are living in. I wish that Nike, I wish the UN, I wish they had a human flourishing conference, and they had it in Egypt, and they had it in, I've never seen a UN human flourishing conference. Yes. Yeah, no carbon, so net zero. So it really means eliminating our impact on climate. So that's the way it's been framed for a long time. The goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and then the evil is increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look at, so that's really been the goal. That's been the 100, the negative 100. And then energy has really been a side issue. It's really been a side issue. What it's really been, it's just been the object of reassurance. It's basically, okay, we're going to pursue this goal, but don't worry, you can pretty much have the same life, and we're just going to say some vague things about solar panels and wind turbines, and maybe that'll work. But what I want to emphasize, because this is really important for the reactive, uninspiring, there's been almost no focus on energy. The whole focus has been on climate, and are we impacting climate, or how do we get rid of our impact on climate? And then it's sort of a side issue, what's that going to do to energy? And what happens is, I can talk in a minute about what that's wrong, but why that's wrong. What happens is then the anti-fossil fuel side is always arguing to 100, and the pro-fossil fuel side is always what I call arguing to 0. So the anti-fossil fuel side says, hey, let's have a Green New Deal. Let's have Build Back Better. Let's have an Inflation Reduction Act. And what the pro-fossil fuel side will say is, what they usually don't say is, no, your goal is wrong. our goal should not be eliminating greenhouse gas emissions at all costs. That is not a good goal. We'll talk about that in a second. But instead, they concede the goal, but what do they say? They say that's impractical. Like, oh, the Green New Deal is impractical. I now work with a lot of politicians and have a lot of success, but I used to not have success. And one response I would get is I would say, hey, you should have actually a positive policy. They say, no, we'll just say the Democrats are crazy because they want the Green New Deal, and that'll be it. That's our response. But what happens is they say, oh, there's a Green New Deal, and then the Republicans might say, oh, well, this particular plan won't work, or it'll cost too much money, or cap and trade is cap and tax. But the way you can think of it is, I can't move because I have this microphone, but like this is 100, this is negative 100, and I'm at 0. And so the other side said they frame the goal as eliminate GHG emissions. And then they say, hey, look, the Green New Deal is going to get us there. And then the fossil fuel supporters say, no, it's impractical. And oh, Build Back Better is impractical. But then, eventually they pass something like the Inflation Reduction Act and they keep moving in that direction. And the argument about energy always becomes this very uninspiring, reactive thing. Like, no, we can't get there as quickly as you want. Like, you look at all the oil companies, right? We want to be net zero. It's going to take a little longer than you think. But it's the opposite of inspiring. And I think if you think the debate is going wrong on an issue, you should always question the framing. What's the good? What's the bad? What's the 100? What's the negative 100? And in this case, I think this has really been the key to what's been successful in my work, we should just reject this idea that our number one goal in the world should be eliminate GHG emissions. Even if they're significantly harmful, it can't be the number one goal. It at most is a derivative issue. And I think the number one goal when you're thinking of global issues should be, and this is why the subtitle of my book is what it is, it should be about global human flourishing. So global human flourishing means humans living to their highest potential, human beings living. This includes having the opportunity to live long lives, healthy lives, safe lives, opportunity-filled lives that can be fulfilling. And then a key aspect, once you start thinking in terms of human flourishing, it's pretty obvious that energy is crucial to human flourishing. So another 100 is global human empowerment, that 8 billion people have energy that's low cost, reliable, abundant. It has those qualities to it. And once you start thinking this way, it's a totally different feeling. And people get a totally different sense, and you can actually argue for what's true. And this is a subtitle of my book, why global human flourishing requires more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. Because once you view the world in terms of human flourishing, and we need more human flourishing, and you view it in terms of energy, it becomes very obvious that the world is very underpowered. So instead of, you don't argue this thing like, hey, it's going to be hard to switch to transition to solar and wind. You see the whole world differently. You see it as, no, the world needs far more energy. There needs to be far more opportunity to flourish. And so obviously, even if there are good alternatives, we need more fossil fuels. So it's just a totally different reframing in thinking. And then it's much more effective in practice. So I'm going to share some facts. I'm going to go into more detail about this in my presentation tonight. Also, you should come tonight because I have I Love Fossil Fuels pins for everyone. So you can wear them proudly and a whole bunch of other resources. But I really wanted to stress here and make sure I covered some different stuff, this issue of framing and reframing it in terms of global human flourishing and global human empowerment. That's the accurate way to do it if you care about human life. And climate is a derivative issue. That's very important. I know this is a climate conference, and it's Heartland Institute I admire immensely for bringing together courageous people to question climate catastrophism, but it's still true logically. Climate is just an aspect of energy in terms of policy. CO2 is a side effect of fossil fuel use. Whenever you're thinking of anything with a side effect, you always have to think about the benefit. You have to carefully weigh it. You also have to carefully weigh the benefits and any negatives of the side effect, which, like the CO2 Coalition is good at looking at the positives of CO2. We always have to look at it as an energy issue. So when I'm presenting this to audiences, I focus a lot on this issue of global human flourishing. And again, I'll elaborate more tonight, but I just want to give you the flavor of how it all fits together once you have this pro-human, pro-energy focus. So point one is cost-effective energy is essential to human flourishing. It's no coincidence that as we've used more fossil fuels, which is what CO2 emissions are a proxy for, we have longer lives, we have more resources reflected in higher income, the planet can support way more people, because energy gives us the ability to use machines to be productive and prosperous, and the more cost-effective energy is, the more we can use machines to be productive and prosperous. And if anyone, by the way, is interested in the slides, you can just send an email to resources@alexepstein.com to get all of my resources for free. I'll promote this again tonight, and there will also be cards that you can fill out if that makes it easier. But feel free to take pictures just so you know you can get the slides easily that way. Okay, so there's this one point is one, cost-effective energy is essential to human flourishing. Now, point two is that billions of people lack cost-effective energy. This is such an easy point to make, and yet it's been so under-stressed. It's starting to get better, but it's still under stress. So we have, look at this chart. We have a third of the world using animal dung for their heating and cooking. So the point is not, oh, we can't quite get away. It's going to be hard for us to not use fossil fuels. The point is, the world is underpowered. Like 6 billion people use an amount of energy we would consider totally unacceptable. Like if you look back when I was born in 1980, like China and India were so poor. And they've something like sextupled or septupled their use of fossil fuels to become far more wealthy. So we should look at the world back then and say, wow, that was terrible compared to today. That's how we should look at today compared to the future. It's just the world is still so underpowered and everyone treats it like, oh, we have enough energy. So let's just figure out how to get the energy from a different source. That's not the right way to think of it. And then one statistic I like a lot, which I got from my buddy Robert Bryce, is 3 billion people use less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. So just think about where we are in terms of energy. Like we really need to think about it. This is essential to human flourishing, and the world is drastically underpowered. And then you get to, well, fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. When people talk about transition and the problems of transitioning, they don't focus nearly enough on cost-effective. They focus just on possibility. They'll say, oh, well, like, is it possible for us to do it? And one person was criticizing me recently and said, hey, wait a second, it's possible. Look, there are all these European countries who have somewhat reduced their fossil fuel use, at least per capita. And it's like, okay, well, sometimes that can happen cost effectively, but look, what has happened to most of these European countries? They've gotten worse. Like, this person used Germany as a success story. Is that a success story where your consumer electricity prices double? Is California, where I live, a success story? So it's all about cost effective, because the more cost effective energy is, the more human beings can flourish. It's not about political possibility or cultural possibility. It's what's actually good for human flourishing. And it's definitely not good to reduce fossil fuel use, certainly not on a global scale. And if you just look at the basic facts, I'll talk more about this tonight, but we have, as I said, the world is drastically underpowered. Fossil fuels provide 80% of the world's energy. Fossil fuel use is still growing. It's growing particularly in the parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy. So it's just crazy to think, oh, let's rapidly replace this. And then there's this argument, again, which I'll talk about more, which, I'll go into that more, but solar and wind are rapidly replacing fossil fuels. It's not true. Like they just provide electricity. They're still at less than 5% of the world's energy. They're heavily subsidized, mandated, and preferred. It's just, but the point I really want to stress here is not so much picking on solar and wind, although we should pick a lot on forced solar and wind, but it's really recognizing the world is a place that needs far more energy for humans to flourish, and that being the framing, not the reactive, not reacting to, oh, the goal is to get rid of emissions, and is it possible to get rid of fossil fuels on some timetable? So just want to stress before we do questions that we are really at a special moment today educationally on this issue. I've been on this issue for about 15, 16 years now, but just looking at the history of it, I don't think there's been an opportunity like this since the 70s where people are aware of the consequences of the establishment's bad policies. And whenever you have an energy crisis or a crisis of any kind, the establishment comes into question. So when the establishment comes into question, people's minds are open. This is why Biden is being so defensive about like, oh, I never opposed fossil fuels and all these ridiculous lies, because people are seeing there's a real problem with opposing fossil fuels. So I think this is the time to get, to promote good thinking about energy, good thinking about climate. And it's really, so even if you've tried in the past and it hasn't worked as well as you wanted, there's a cultural opportunity. And then I would also argue the arguments have been developed over the years a lot better. And one thing, I have this new book, Fossil Future, that you can check out. So the disadvantage of that is it costs $20. So that's a challenge. It limits the scalability of it. But one thing that has no scaling problems is a free resource called energytalkingpoints.com, which you can also just get by getting on my mailing list. And this has talking points, powerful, well-referenced points on every energy, environmental, and climate issue you can imagine. It involves arguing to 100. It focuses on global human flourishing. And I think with these tools, you can just be incredibly, incredibly effective because the internet gives you limitless distribution, and these are some of the most effective arguments. So overall message is we got to stop arguing to 0, start arguing to 100, not let this be framed as a climate discussion. This is a discussion about human flourishing and about energy. Climate is just an aspect of this. And if you really stand for global human flourishing and global human empowerment, you, unlike the fossil fuel industry, can become great. And I would just say one more thing, though, which is the fossil fuel industry is starting to pick up on this, and we're getting some CEOs to actually stand up. And I just made a deal today to speak at an event called Fossil Fueled. So imagine the fossil fuel industry has a huge event coming up in a couple months called Fossil Fueled. I think that's progress, and I think we can make more of it. Thank you very much.